You'd think that there are many roads to mastering Chinese, but in truth, there are only three. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about mastering Chinese, but the episode should be interesting for everybody, no matter how close you are to mastery yourself. So beginners and intermediate students shouldn't turn the podcast off yet. There is a lot of talk about the F word in the online world of language learning, and people discuss questions such as what does it mean to be fluent, and what's the best way to become fluent in a language, and maybe how quickly can you get there. The answers to these questions depend on the definition of fluency, and everybody has their own definition, and so the answers will vary. For some people, fluency is when you can speak without getting stuck too often, and for other people, fluency is just a different word for near native or mastery, which is what we're going to talk about in this episode. For me, fluency means being able to efficiently use the language you've learned, and this is something I discussed in episode 99 of the podcast, where we talked about how to become fluent in Chinese. By this definition, then, you can be fluent as a beginner, and that assumes then that you have practiced a lot and can use the words and the grammar and so on that you have learned to reach communicative goals. It also follows that you can have reached a fairly advanced level without being fluent at all, because you might not know these things well enough or have practiced enough to be able to use them effectively. When I say mastery in this episode, I mean the end state we can get to as second language learners. This is a very advanced level, but it's still not a native speaker level. Native speakers are extremely good at some things, although we as second language learners can of course be good at other things. But we are unlikely to match native speakers when it comes to things like syntax and phonology, because not having grown up with the language makes quite a big difference here. So for example, I think I can claim mastery of English to a certain extent at least, but I'm clearly not a native speaker. My written Chinese is not nearly as good as my written English, but my spoken Chinese probably sounds more natural than my spoken English, considering how much more time I've spent speaking Chinese compared to English. Since we're talking about mastering Chinese here, I will also add my own personal thoughts and reflections for each of the roads that we're going to look at. Mastering Chinese, or indeed anything else in life, is largely about finding ways to invest a lot of time and energy into something and being able to do so for a very long time. You might think that there are many ways of doing that in Chinese, but I do think that there are in fact only three roads. It could be that I've missed something, and if you have a strong candidate for a fourth road, feel free to head over to Hacking Chinese and leave a comment. So let's explore these three roads to mastery, and for each I will explain how it works, and then I will also add some personal reflections about my own learning. So the first road to Chinese mastery is using Chinese in your job. If Chinese is an integral part of your job and you need to interact in Chinese with native speakers or other advanced speakers of Chinese daily, and you do that for a long time, you will learn a lot. While you can learn even more if you add some directed self-studying on the side, simply being in an environment where you use Chinese all the time to engage with others, solve problems, complete complicated tasks, and so on, will mean that you will reach mastery sooner or later. Most people spend a third or more of their time on work or work-related things, and if a majority of this is in Chinese, well then it follows that you will reach mastery sooner or later. Naturally, it depends on what your job is and how much Chinese you use and how varied it is. I mean, for example, if you work with interpreting or translation, you work with the language itself, which is probably the best way, but simply having Chinese colleagues or Chinese as the company language will probably be enough in most cases. So how am I doing when it comes to using Chinese in my job? Well, my case is a little bit special because I work a lot with Chinese rather than in Chinese. For example, writing this article, I didn't learn any Chinese and I didn't read anything or listen to anything in Chinese either. I do, of course, research things in Chinese sometimes, and I research the Chinese language all the time in order to be able to answer student questions, write things, and so on. But this is nowhere near as intense as actually using Chinese as, for example, you do when you work at a company where Chinese is the main language. Still, I do teach some Chinese, which counts for something. For example, I teach a professional development course at university for Chinese teachers, where most of the participants are in Chinese and the whole course is in Chinese. And these things obviously help me a lot. Well, the goal with these courses is not to educate myself, but that is, of course, one of the side effects, and it's a good one. If you're curious what I work with beyond hacking Chinese, you can check out episode 152. Let's now continue with the second road to Chinese mastery, which is cultivating a genuine interest. Some people spend more time with hobbies and interests than they do with work, and it follows then that if you can cultivate a genuine interest for things in Chinese or things related to Chinese, that it can also be a path to mastery. The problem I think most learners face here is that you might start learning Chinese with a strong interest in the language and culture and so on, but as the years go by, well, you might still be interested in Chinese, but not as much as you used to be. And for this road to actually lead to mastery, it has to be something that can power your learning for many years, not just a few years when you start. What you need is strong intrinsic motivation, i.e. motivation that comes from the activity itself and an interest in Chinese for its own sake or for things that you do in Chinese. And this is something we talked more about in episode 188, which was all about long-term motivation. Just to mention an example here to make sure that it's clear what I mean, let's say you have a very strong interest in wuxia novels, and that's all you want to do in your spare time. Well, you might end up reading dozens of novels every year, watching a ton of movies, participating in online discussions about wuxia and so on. And you don't do these things to improve your Chinese, but because you have this genuine interest in something that is related to Chinese or in Chinese. Depending on what your hobby or interest is, it might not enable you to master all aspects of the Chinese language, but there usually are ways to involve all aspects. So, for example, even if you're interested in reading something, you then also want to talk about it with other people who are also interested in reading that, even if the hobby or interest itself is about reading. So, how am I doing when it comes to a genuine interest? Well, I think I only partially qualify here. Chinese is not the most fascinating thing in the world to me, and I have too many other interests to focus solely on Chinese, and most of these interests can be partly converted to Chinese, but not all of them, and most of them with some kind of sacrifice. As an example, I enjoy reading, and one of the genres I enjoy is science fiction, and I've read a lot of science fiction in Chinese, but I simply don't think that the novels I've read in Chinese are as interesting as many of the novels I've read in English, so if I were to read only in Chinese, that would entail a certain sacrifice. This is true for my more work-related interests as well. So for example, I have a strong interest in phonology and listening comprehension, and while these things can be studied in Chinese only, that again entails a certain sacrifice because most of the research is written in English, not in Chinese. This brings us to the third road to mastering Chinese, having your social life in Chinese. In the draft of this article, this third road was called marry someone who speaks Chinese, but I think this is misleading and a little bit too narrow. The point here is that if a majority of your social interactions are in Chinese, you will learn a lot from it and probably reach some kind of mastery after a while. This also explains why marrying someone or living with someone isn't enough, because of course it also assumes that you then speak only Chinese with them, which is not a given. This is a little bit similar to living in China, which can teach you an awful lot about Chinese language and culture, but it could also teach you nothing depending on what you do and if you lead your life entirely in English and hang out with other expats. As usual, the point is not where you are or whom you're hanging out with, but how much Chinese you use. That's what's going to lead to mastery eventually. Naturally, marriage then is just one way to engage in a lot of meaningful communication in Chinese, but there are others. You could have many and close friends in Chinese and hang out with them and speak Chinese a lot and achieve mastery that way. So what's my experience when it comes to having my social life in Chinese then? I'm doing pretty well in this area. I've been together with my wife, who's from Beijing, for well over a decade now, and we've spoken mostly Chinese during this entire time. I also spent 4 years in Taiwan, where close to 100% of my social life was in Chinese. Although these days, when I'm back in Sweden, I clearly don't speak as much Chinese as I used to. At home, we also speak English and some Swedish, so there is a mix of languages, although of course many of the interactions are in Chinese. This last bit about living in Sweden, though, I think is important. If you really want to take this road all the way to mastery, I think maybe you do need to live in a Chinese-speaking environment. There are simply many things that you can't really learn when you're not, and most of these are related to culture, how people behave, how they think, how they interact, and so on, which are simply hard to learn from abroad. This is something I will probably return to in an upcoming episode. So now that I've described the 3 roads, we can talk a little bit more about them in general. First, I think it should be clear that different roads lead to different kinds of mastery. I already touched on this briefly earlier, but for example, if your social life is in Chinese, that is probably great for your spoken Mandarin, but it depends a lot on whom you're interacting with and how much written language you use for how much of a positive impact this has on your written language. The same is true for work and hobbies, as I mentioned when I talked about them. Depending on exactly what you're doing and how broadly you use this to power your learning, it could be that you're focusing on a small aspect of the language. While I think it helps thinking about these as 3 separate roads, it's obviously not the case that you need to choose one and stay on it. This is partly the reason why I included my own reflections and thoughts about my own situation here, because clearly you can reach mastery by combining these roads as well. However, after having thought about this topic for a few years, I still think that these 3 roads are the main ones, but like I said, if you have an idea for a 4th road, do let me know. Another thing worth discussing before we wrap up this episode is which roads to take, because this is sometimes something you can choose, but often it isn't. In some cases, you can influence the probability that you can walk down one or several of these roads, but ultimately where you end up is determined by serendipity or fate or something similar, not exactly your own plans and your choices. For example, most people don't choose their partners based on the language they speak, so saying something like, "Sorry, I do love you, but you speak the wrong language," seems a bit odd to most of us and is actually quite repelling. Still, whom you end up spending most of your life with also depends on choices that you make. So for example, if you live in a Chinese-speaking environment and hang out only with native speakers, you're very likely to find your significant other in this group of people, because those are the only people you hang out with. You have somewhat more control over work, but here you are also limited by what is feasible, what can earn you a living, and so on. You have the most control when it comes to your own interests, but as I said earlier, just magically conjuring up a genuine interest for something is rather hard, and not all hobbies can be easily combined with Chinese, or they don't benefit from doing that. And if you're mostly interested in the hobby, then that means you will use less Chinese, and that road might not take you to mastery. Well, it might take you to mastery of your hobby, but not of Chinese. To conclude this episode, I'd like to say that mastering Chinese is no small task, and every learner's journey will look different. However, I do believe that those who reach mastery will do so largely through one or several of the roads that I've talked about in this episode. The encouraging thing here should be that it's largely about motivation and about investing time, not about being talented, super smart, or something like that. I do genuinely believe that anybody can master Chinese, even if they start learning later in life, provided that they follow at least one of these roads and invest enough time. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.